Hello everyone, in this video we're going to describe about the case study of Wyong Shire Council versus Shire, which occurred in 1980. In this part we'll discuss about what is negligence. Negligence means a failure to behave with a level of care that a person of ordinary judgment would have exercised under the same circumstances. A crucial element which we are establishing a case of negligence is if the incident can be foreseeable of the risk which can cause harm or might result in an injury. If in a particular case a loss is caused which is not foreseeable, then remedies cannot be taken for the same time as when there was an intentional case of negligence. A case of Wyong Shire Council versus Shire is an important case which looks to the foreseeability of harm, standard of care, and also for the establishment of a breach of duty of care. Since then, this case has been used as a standard level of negligence and has shown that to consider the foreseeability of a particular person's loss, it must be considered from a reasonable person's viewpoint.
Fact of the case. In this case, a channel had been dug by the Wyong Shire Council, the respondent in the Tuggerah Lakes, New South Wales. The council had raised the sign which read "Profound Water." The offended party for the situation was skiing in a circuit, and this circuit was frequently utilized by water skiers. One day while skiing, the offended party fell in the water and his head got struck on the bed of the lake. Subsequently, the offended party was harmed gravely. The water of the lake was shallow at specific regions, which caused the wounds of the litigant. A case was started by the offended party against the respondent for their carelessness, and he guaranteed harms for the embarrassed carelessness. The inquiry for the situation was that whether the gathering embraced carelessness or had their obligation of care been released because of the shine raised by them with respect to the water being excessively shallow. In this way, the court needed to consider whether the board had embraced this standard of care and acted in a sensible way with respect to the danger of damage which could have occurred in the awful condition to the water scheme.
Side of the plaintiff. The offended party started this case by expressing that the defendant has been careless and failed to fulfill their responsibility which they owed to each one of those people who skied in the lake. The defendant owed an obligation of care towards the offended party. The break of it, the offended party being harmed, the predictability of casualty, the immediate causation and remoteness of losses. In order to bring the light to this case, the offended party referred to the case of Dong versus Stevenson. In that case, the court has expressed that the relationship between the manufacturer and the consumer and the unhygienic drink that followed the injury of the party prompted S being held as having owned a responsibility towards D and thus needed to reply D for her casualty and resulting injury causes of S carelessness. For this case, the council owned a responsibility towards the offended party as they were the manufacturer of the channel and needed to guarantee that the place was safe to ski. This is on account of the council realized that this place was routinely being utilized for such purposes. The offended party want to feature that the obligation of care was broken by the council. Even though the defendant has put sign which demonstrated that the water was deep, it failed to express that the deep water could harm the skiing individuals. Hence, in this, there has been a break of obligation of care. The following prerequisite is for the offended party to demonstrate the sensible predictability of the damage of mischief. For this, the offended party took the assistance of the decision given in the Wyong Mount case, which is completely known as the Overseas Tranship Limited versus Morts Dock and Engineering Co. Limited. The court has held that because of the remoteness of harm, the damage couldn't be granted, and it was also stated for this situation that the predictability is available even in situation where it is a distant chance. The court made compulsory that for proper discharge of responsibility, certain steps must be taken to guarantee the safety. For this situation, the defendant was just informed as a deep water sign rather than being a warning. Hence, the responsibility was not discharged, which led to damages which could not be outlooked as a possibility. Bolton versus Stone is another case which the offended party used in this specific instance. For this situation, likely there was an absence of predictability, thus the harms were not avoided. At the point when the predictability of hazard is to be stated, rather than judging the impossibility or likelihood of an event, it is to be seen that the hazard is not unrealistic, despite of the fact that there are situations where the likelihood of one hazard is higher than the other. It doesn't imply that the more improbable hazard is to be taken as not predictable. For this situation, the defendant knew about the way that a man could be harmed because of the shallow water. They knew individuals continually utilize the place for various purposes, and still they just raised a deep water sign. They didn't find a way to verify that the general population knew about the idea that jumping in the water could be unsafe. It was predictable for the defendant that a man could get harmed on the off chance that they jumped in the water, as the water levels were diverse at better places. The information was not with the offended party, but rather with the defendant. Consequently, there was a reasonable predictability of danger of damage for the defendant, but then they picked not to follow up on the same. But by not following up on the sensible predictability of danger of mischief, the counsel in the present case broke their obligation of care. By simply raising a sign, the obligation of care is not released. For this situation, the court has held that by neglecting to erect sign, which really made the offended party mindful about the likelihood of damage rather than giving basic data, was a break of obligation of care on the part of the defendant. This was combined with the need on the part of the defendant in making wall or other comparable gatekeepers, which could have really prevented the general population from jumping in the lake. A point which can be raised on this premises by the defendant of the present case is that in the cited case, the offended party was 14 years old and subsequently did not have the comprehensive of the likelihood of danger of damage. The offended party eliminated that any sensible individual in the current condition couldn't have judged that jumping in the lake could bring about noteworthy damage, as the sign really indicated deep water. The offended party didn't know about the way that the surface was uneven at the places and not actually deep. Along this line, by jumping in the deep water, the offended party would not have been harmed. As it were, the sign neglected to give the right picture. Along this line, a man, depending upon the sign, may jump in the water, imagining that they would not hit their head, but rather, as a general rule, they would get harmed as the water was not deep. Along these lines, aside from informative sign, the offended party want to point out the carelessness on part of the defendant in setting up mixed-up signs. The offended party was inexperienced skier and wanted to jump in deep water. He really accepted on the sign that the water was deep and jumped in the lake, not realizing that the surface was uneven. Furthermore, because of this material breach in the responsibility, the offended party would ask for the court to award appropriate compensation to the offended party for the damage sustained by him.
Decision of the court was held at the risks for the carelessness and the negligence, and also was held at the risks for the attempted negligence in wrongly setting up the sign. So the defender is required to pay the harms and all the cost, trouble, and the burden that the plaintiff has suffered. In this case, the standard of care is higher. So for the proper duty of care and for the counsel negligence, the judge has held that to prevent the further injury, the defender has to put up the deep water sign on those areas. The court has also decided to view other clashing obligation of the respondent. Additionally, the forcibility of the damage could not be whimsical or too outlandish. Because of this reason, the council was held at the risk of negligence.
Conclusion: overall, the case of the Wyong Castle versus portrays the matters where the foreseeability of the potential risk has to be decided upon. The castle has presented evidences which the plaintiff was injured due to the defendant's negligence. This case is supported by many cases from the past to clarify the fact the defendant was aware of the risk it may cause significant harm to employees due to the shallow water. After establishing the breach of the duty of care and resulting injury, the judge held that the foreseeability of the potential risk is reasonably foreseeable. Nevertheless, the foreseeability of the risk cannot be too fanciful or far-fetched, and the defendant has responsibility to minimize the breach of duty of care in the workplace. The judge also held the defendant was negligent and was required to compensate the plaintiff's injury.